Arise. Arise. What is arise again? Control-Alt-7?
Good evening. Vampires are things that have become somewhat of a staple in just the collective conscience. We all have a general idea of what a vampire is. They're undead, they drink blood and stalk the night. But the details vary from myth to story, and all the lore comes from somewhere and then builds upon each other. And today, I will endeavor to do a, hopefully not too long, retelling of the history of vampires. Specifically on screen, but we have to get through a bunch of other stuff before we get to that. The history of vampires is long and varied. There is very little that remains entirely consistent between vampire stories in terms of lore. There are early vampiric folklores from numerous cultures, though. The most reported is that of the Slavic Upior, or Upir, which I do not know if I'm pronouncing correctly, a word of uncertain origin that some consider to roughly translate to the thing at the feast or sacrifice. First seen mentioned in writing in a 2nd century Old Russian text. The reason this is probably the most reported is because it is most directly connected to the majority of people's idea of a vampire. But there are other figures that can also be viewed in connection to the idea of vampirism, such as Beital from an 11th century Sanskrit story who was part bat and drank human blood. When this story was translated to English in the 19th century, it was renamed Vikram and the Vampire. It wasn't until the 1720s, 1725 to be precise, however, that the term vampire was first used, according to Nick Broom, author of The Vampire, A New History. This was during a time when the Habsburg Empire had recently annexed some eastern territory, and strange reports started being heard. Reports of bodies being exhumed and staked because it had apparently been terrorizing the town. Now, the word vampire itself comes from French, from Hungarian vampire, and perhaps also from the Turkish word ur, for witch. So it's not entirely clear 100% of its origins, but this was the term reports used when speaking of the strange things happening in Eastern Europe. From Bella Isaac Thomas's article, How Vampire Lore Emerged from Shadowy Medical Mysteries, she said, over the next decade, Broom noted, fascination with the concept of vampires spread across Europe. Interdisciplinary teams of military officials, medical officers, magistrates, theologians, and philosophers carried out investigations into claims of vampiric activity, exercising Enlightenment-era reasoning. There are also many diseases which are thought to have perhaps influenced the belief of vampires and the mythology or lore surrounding vampirism. Further evidence suggests that these diseases likely more so reinforce pre-existing beliefs rather than create them. Some diseases like pellagra, a disease that makes people very sensitive to the sun. Quote, by the mid-18th century, a report from Austrian Empress's personal physician determined the existence of vampires to be a medical impossibility, and disparaged the Slavic communities whose folklore had long considered them a real threat. This is from Stanley Stepanek, a professor of Slavic history, I believe. He also wrote that the vampire was primarily a symbol of things they didn't understand. Many of the most famous and influential vampire films and television shows are adaptations, so it is paramount we first discuss the biggest step forward in vampires in popular culture, and that is, of course, books. It is in these novels of the 19th century especially that made vampires a staple of the romantic gothic genre. That was kind of when that genre formed in large part. The first book to do this is likely John William Polidori's The Vampire, spelled with a Y, written in 1819. It is well documented that this story was written for a challenge of sorts between Polidori, Lord Byron, and the Shelleys while they were staying in a house that Byron had rented near Geneva. This is the same challenge during which Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. The Vampire introduces many elements of the romantic/gothic vampire fiction that would follow it, with the vampire being charming, young, and attractive, an aristocrat who seduces an innocent woman. The book was originally falsely credited to Lord Byron, though this was fixed in future publications, though many believe its success can partly be attributed to the initial belief that Byron wrote it, as he was a much more known figure than Polidori. Alan A. John, an author of the article Vampire Evolution, credits the vampire with being the progenitor of the romantic vampire genre that is now very prevalent within fantasy fiction. However, it is certainly not the most famous. You might not have even heard about this book, and strangely it has very few, if any, direct adaptations to screen. There is one that has been in the works for several years now, though news on it is scarce. Two novels that came out later in the 19th century would far eclipse the vampire in public consciousness, and the first of these being Carmela. Carmela is an 1872 novel by Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu. It is widely considered to be the prototypical lesbian vampire story, and likely the first to have the primary vampire in the tale be a woman. Though obviously at the time this was mostly used to make Carmela the vampiress appear more villainous, as her romantic attraction to the protagonist was seen as an evil thing alongside her vampirism. Most of the early adaptations of Carmela, however, censor or entirely remove the gay parts of the novel. And the subsequent ones who did include it, such as the 1960 French film Et Mourir de Plaisir and 1972's The Blood-Splattered Bride, mostly included that in implication and undertones, which is more fitting to the book. There was also a web series some of my friends are fans of from 2014, which is a modern take on the story, and since I haven't seen it, I'm not going to go into much detail. Carmela has continued to be a recurring character throughout media, having an opera, appearing in video games, and having multiple stage adaptations. The lesbian vampire has become a sort of genre within Gothic horror, especially within the exploitation films of the mid to late-ish 20th century. These vampires usually take on the role of the vamp, a trope similar to the femme fatale, using her beauty and sexuality to corrupt both men and women, and is often villain, and like many things, has actually become also embraced by some members of the queer community as a symbol of being sexually liberated, especially for the era these films took place. However, in these films, the vamp's queerness was usually viewed as a source of further proof of her villainy, and she was prominently sexualized for the male gaze, which has been a problem of lesbian characters or queer women characters in film in general, especially those made by straight men. The sexually liberated woman, especially a queer one, was viewed by the mainstream at the time as a threat to the norm. This is also big in, like I said, these sexploitation lesbian vampire films of the 60s and 70s, like The Vampire Lovers. There were actually about 20 lesbian vampire movies made between 1970 and 1974 alone, in which usually the vampire competed for the love of a woman with a man. And it's noteworthy that a lot of these vampires weren't really depicted as lesbian and more often just depicted as bisexual or queer in general. Now, these films were a part of general rise of exploitation films in the 1970s. These low-budget movies which exploited current events and taboos that previously couldn't be shown in film due to the Hays Code, often with more sex and especially violence and blood. The lesbian vampire movie evolved over time, and a famous example that bridges this previous era to the modern one is 1983's The Hunger, directed by Tony Scott, the same guy who did Top Gun, starring Susan Sarandon, Catherine Deneuve, and David Bowie, and is an extremely 80s movie, which fits more with the genre of erotic horror than its more exploitation-y predecessors. And it ran on to exemplify these kind of films, which would be made in the 80s and 90s. Now, obviously, stories about lesbian vampires or queer women vampires are still being made. A more recent example is the TV show First Kill, which unfortunately got cancelled after one season, but it was centered around the romance of a lesbian couple of a vampire and a vampire hunter. Bram Stoker's 1897 epistolary novel, Dracula, is by far the most famous vampire story in the world. No other story has cemented itself so firmly in the vampire mythos. The amount of Dracula adaptations and interpretations are endless. According to the 2015 Guinness World Records, so take this with a grain of salt, Dracula has been, as of August 2015, portrayed in a total of 538 films, both cinema releases and TV films. And since then, he has been in Dracula, the Netflix miniseries, The Last Voyage of the Demeter from 2022, Penny Dreadful 2016, and many, many more. There's even a new Nosferatu film, and Nosferatu is a loose adaptation of Dracula, making him one of the most adapted, if not the most adapted literary character of all time. Though Dracula is very famous, most people's idea of Dracula doesn't actually come from the book, where he's described as starting old and aging backwards, having a mustache, not dying in the sunlight, simply being weakened by it, and many, many more things. The Dracula that most people think of is actually from Bela Lugosi's portrayal of him in the Universal films, which I covered in my Halloween video last year. But to summarize, the version of Dracula with a high-collared cloak and black hair and widow's peak comes from those films. No other vampire, it could be argued, is so ingrained within the myths of Count Dracula, and Dracula's has been used in films as a stand-in for the word vampires. So, when it comes to influence, there truly is, no other as well-known and as powerful as the Count himself. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire was published in 1976, following the tale of Louis de Poindulac, who recounts his life as a vampire to a young reporter in San Francisco. From his human life as a plantation owner in New Orleans, the end of the 18th century, to Paris. As we established with Carmela, vampires have been gay for a long time, often because of the connection of vampirism with the taboo. One trend that follows throughout many vampire stories is a connection of vampirism with sex, or the closest people could say to sex at the time, seduction. The idea of being seduced by the vampire began back in The Vampire, the Y, and exists again here in Interview with the Vampire. But it always takes the form of the thing that people find taboo. That was seduction of the innocent in the 19th century, women being lured away from the fiancé by the strange evil man in Dracula, and here it is, gay stuff. Though the first book in the series is written ambiguously enough so that it could be interpreted as not being fully in a romantic relationship between Louis and Lestat, the second book, The Vampire Lestat, throws away any pretext of ambiguity, and the series becomes very explicitly queer from then on. When most people think of Interview with the Vampire, unfortunately, they think of the 1994 film directed by Neil Jordan and starring Tom Cruise as Lestat, Brad Pitt as Louis, Kirsten Dunst as Claudia, Antonio Banderas as Armand, and Christian Slater as Daniel, the interviewer, the journalist. The film, while relatively loyal to the book, including keeping its gayness a little bit more ambiguous, also means, much like the first book, Louis, and partially to blame for this is likely Pitt's acting in the role, are a bit boring as a character. The film's not great, though many people love it, and I think Philippe Rousselot's cinematography did a good job capturing the gothic atmosphere, same with the costumes, and I think for the most part people did play their roles for the film well, though perhaps not exactly how they were in the books, but that's not the most important thing at the end of the day. Same with the costumes, which I think were quite good and worked well to show the progression of time throughout the film. I thought that was really well done. The film was both a commercial and a critical success, and Neil Jordan wanted to make a follow-up adapting the second book in the series, The Vampire Lestat, but that film never came to pass. However, in 2002, The Queen of the Damned received a film adaptation which created elements of The Vampire Lestat. The film notoriously took away all the gay elements from the books that it was adapting, and the film is widely either forgotten or disliked. Though I'm sure it has its fans, I can't judge it, I haven't watched it. However, the film was dismissed by Anne Rice herself a year after its release. And in that same interview, she noted that a TV series would be better suited for her work. But that wouldn't come to pass for some time, and a lot would happen in the landscape of vampire media in the meantime. Now segue into the category of what I would loosely describe as modern vampires. Vampires of the end of the 20th and the 21st century. Beginning with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The end of the 20th century and, like I said, going into the 21st century saw a rise in a new type of vampire story. And this being one aimed at teenagers, and as well as being comedies. Vampires of the modern age are not as surrounded in the gothic genre it's so long inhabited, and this arguably began with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. In 1992, the film Buffy the Vampire Slayer, directed by Fran Rubel-Kuzui, was released into theaters. Film, you might ask? Yes, not everyone knows that before becoming the hit television show, Buffy was a movie starring Christy Swanson as the titular Buffy. Most of the cast would be unfamiliar to fans of the show, with the exception of Luke Perry as Oliver Pike and perhaps some other ones that I missed. The movie follows teen vampire hunter Buffy Summers, combining teen movie tropes with the supernatural, sort of like Teen Wolf, which also later went on to become a more popular / more known TV show. And it also introduced the very Joss Whedon sort of brand of humor, which would infiltrate TV and movies for much of the 2000s and 2010s, for better or for worse.
Not a great plan.
The movie was actually a flop critically, but made more than twice back its budget, so 4 years later, they gave Buffy another shot with a TV show, now starring Sarah Michelle Gellar in the title role. Buffy is not a gothic horror show. It can use horror on occasion, but the focus of the tone is mostly comedic or drama, or dramedy, with quippy humor throughout. Its vampires are not often used as horror, but more supernatural. There is a distinction to be made. However, the vampires are also used as romantic interests, namely Spike. With Buffy, I think it's a good point to also differentiate that there is a difference between a vampire story and a vampire hunter story. Because vampire hunter stories is like vampire slayers are the focus, and the vampires tend to be bad guys. Although clearly in Buffy, they're also good vampires or anti-hero vampires, or they switch back and forth. And now I'd say vampire stories are mostly ones where the protagonist is a vampire. There are ones that are both, like Blade, because Blade is both half vampire and also hunts monsters. Buffy laid the foundation of vampires in high school and in the modern world, and this world was a little less dark and dramatic than the stories which came before it. It was amongst the new wave of vampire stories that showed how vampire and supernatural tales can be fun. But we probably all know, unfortunately, what came next. In 2005, a little book would be published that would change the face of vampire media for the rest of the 2000s and 2010s. The book is, of course, Stephenie Meyer's Twilight. This followed the 16-year-old Bella and the love of her life, Edward, a vampire who is 116 years old. But he looks like a teenager, so it's okay.
I turned 17 in 1918. I'll take care of you.
I'm not going to do an in-depth analysis or critique of the Twilight series here. If anything, it'd be disingenuous because I've neither read the books nor watched the movies. But it did show a notable shift in the kinds of vampire media we were seeing for a while. The boom of teen vampires and young adult vampire stories that were trying to kind of capitalize off of Twilight's success. There were countless, but none of them got anywhere near as popular as Twilight. Twilight and Vampire Diaries and the other imitators that's names I couldn't come up with did something a bit unforgivable to vampires, in my opinion. They made them arguably not cool, or at least for a while it made stories about vampires only trying to kind of leech off of the success of Twilight. It made it kind of not much else vampire related was being made, and anything that was made was instantly compared to Twilight, which made it kind of difficult for any of the kind of gothic horror vampire adjacent stuff that we had gotten before to be taken seriously, because now vampires were synonymous with Twilight. Honestly, worse than anything else, in my opinion, this era of vampire media was painfully straight. A huge focus on romance as a part of the romantic vampire stories. The love between a human, usually a woman, and a vampire, usually a dude, now being incredibly popular plot for the vampire stories. Not saying that wasn't a thing before, it definitely was, but gossip romances, it had an emphasis on it kind of being dark, or the romance itself wasn't the point. And now also there's a lot of love triangle stuff, which I don't have to get into how annoying love triangles are here. I think people know that by now. However, the past couple years, there has been some steps to fix this travesty. This comes in the form of some new vampire TV shows especially, such as First Kill, like we mentioned before, Interview with the Vampire, and What We Do in the Shadows. The 2014 mockumentary film, What We Do in the Shadows, written and directed by Jermaine Clement and Taika Waititi, is probably the biggest strictly comedy film that follows vampires as the central characters that I can think of. You clearly get a lot out of this premise of vampires existing in the modern world in a mockumentary format. You can show how kind of mock the strange lores that have come up around vampires and their interactions with humans as well as other supernatural creatures. Clearly enough material there because there's also a TV show, What We Do in the Shadows, created by Jermaine Clement, as well as a spin-off called What Ellington Paranormal, which is very funny, go watch it, but it's less specifically vampire focused. The show is really great. I would say the tones of the show and the film are quite different, with the type of humor changing between the two, and I think that is where they work, because the show, and how it differentiates itself from the movie, makes it very much its own thing, with its own set of characters and jokes and setting.
New York City.
The show also embraces queerness of vampires, which, like I said, is good. That is something that's kind of been enmeshed with vampire stories for a very long time.
Trust me, gay is in, gay is hot. I want some gay, gay it's gonna be.
And more than anything else, What We Do in the Shadows shows how vampires make for a very comedic premise as well as drama. And it kind of exists within the same realm of other supernatural comedy shows like Ghosts. And hopefully there will be more supernatural comedies to come. Created by Roland Jones for AMC+, the television show Interview with the Vampire has been in the works for a long time. But it aired its first season in 2022, and just recently the second season in 2024, with a third season confirmed. The first two seasons were originally meant to be one season, I believe, adapting the first book in the series, Interview with the Vampire, but it was split into two seasons, and now the next season will be adapting The Vampire Lestat, the book finally going to make its way to the screen. I love this show. It's one of my favorite shows in general, and fully captures all aspects of vampire stories that I find interesting and love. It also takes the best parts of an admittedly flawed book series and makes something better with it, which is really the best thing you could want out of an adaptation. The show stars Jacob Anderson as Louis, Sam Reed as Lestat, Bailey Bass and Delaney Hales as Claudia, Asad Zaman as Armand, and Eric Bogosian as Daniel. It changes the beginning point, with Louis now being a human in the 1910s, as well as being gay instead of bisexual, and a black man. And the show fully doesn't shy away from all the implications and changes in the story that those decisions make. And I think it does a really good job with it. They also changed the framing device a little, with the initial interview, the one that is closer to the one within the book, having occurred between Louis and Daniel in the 70s, but had never been finished, and now 50 years later, they are doing the interview once more. The show is a gothic/horror show, but it can be funny on occasion as well, as all good dramatic shows ought to be. It's bloody, it's very gay, it's got a lot of very complicated relationships, both interpersonal ones and internal ones, and questions of humanity, love, memory, existence, almost everything that comes with the territory of vampirism is explored in some way in the show, and I think it is currently one of the best pieces of vampire media out there. There's obviously a lot of other vampire media that has come up. Some examples of popular ones are stuff like Castlevania, The Lost Boys, and the hit film Morbius.
It's Morbid time.
Things which I like to think of as genre vampire films, which are vampire stories that kind of combine with another thing, like Blade, which is both vampires but also comic books, and Underworld, which is, again, like vampires, but also, I think the Underworld movies very much just kind of took from the Matrix aesthetic. So like vampire action movies. Like, that's like an example of what I would call a vampire genre movie. In the time since originally filming this video, the movie Sinners came out, and I've seen it twice in theaters. The movie is about a lot of things, but the vampire aspect is in part a metaphor for colonization and racism, for the forced assimilation into an invading culture. By turning the characters into vampires, they're put under some kind of thrall and become a part of this hive mind of sorts, only broken once the original vampire has been killed. The idea of vampires as metaphor for colonization can be seen in other works, such as the graphic novel series 30 Days of Night, where the mostly native Inuit of a small town are attacked by white vampires, and the sheriff, an Inuit man named Eben, and his wife Stella must fend them off. Although, according to my friend Cheese, who has shown up in my videos before, I actually got in contact with the author for a school project, and apparently the metaphor wasn't intentional, even though it seems to be pretty apparent if you read the comics. However, in the movie adaptation, as Hollywood often does, in the Eben, the protagonist is played by Josh Hartnett, who's white. And we love Josh Hartnett in this house, but that's not very good casting and an example of whitewashing and also getting rid of this potent element of the story. Also, I love Sinners, and I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to go too deep into the story, and it's still in theaters as of recording this, so I highly encourage you to go see it. In her book, Our Vampires Ourselves, Nina Auerbach writes, "Every age embraces the vampire it needs. And the vampires today need seems to be a mix of the ones from Into the Vampire and the ones from Sinners." Vampire stories ask the questions such as, can you love a monster? What is a monster and what is human? Discusses the existential dread of living forever, and many, many more. Vampires can be so many things and can be portrayed in so many ways. I think that is part of the appeal. The existence of one version of the lore of vampires where perhaps in your story the sun kills them and they can't go near garlic, but in another's, those have no effect. But that doesn't negate the lore of any other stories. You can love Twilight and hate Interview with the Vampire. I won't want to be your friend if that is the case, but it's valid. There are so many stories that can be told, and there's something for everyone. Because we all, or at least a lot of us, seem to love stories of these blood-sucking beings. Vampires have been symbols of things that society fears and doesn't understand. Foreigners, sexuality, queerness, whatever the person at the helm wants them to be. Some stories like to focus on the dual nature of that, of how vampires interact with humanity, as they were, in most of the lore, at one point human, and can still exist among them in one way or another. Or perhaps the question of the eternal life nature of vampirism, and how long life and memory and existence and companionship and all of the other things that come with that. A vampire can be the hero, the villain, the monster, the lover, the friend, and/or a combination of all of the above. There's so much that can be done with a vampire story. Endless tales of blood, love, life, death, and so much more. I don't even have to hope. We know they're going to keep making more stories about this, and you can just look online because there's lots coming out soon. Also, this was originally recorded before Halloween, which was the original end of the video, was me saying Happy Halloween. But instead, please like, comment, subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.